Half of mental health conditions begin by age 14, and 75% of mental health conditions develop by age 24. Welcome to another episode of Health and Wellness. Today on the program, we're going to speak on the issue of mental illness and how it affects families, friends, and the environment. Joining me today is retired professor of psychology, Alfonso Siverls. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
We all have mental health. It is just as important as physical health. It is not only about mental illness or mental disorders. This is just one part of a bigger picture. It's best to think about mental health as being on a continuum, rather than people being either mentally ill or mentally well. We are all on the continuum, and we move up and down according to factors such as our genetic makeup and upbringing, our life circumstances, and the stresses we are under. The World Health Organization describes mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Being mentally healthy means being resilient and able to cope with difficult times, feeling in control, being confident, feeling good about yourself, managing and expressing your emotions, building and maintaining good relationships. We all experience periods when we feel stressed, worried, anxious, sad, afraid, or angry. These are all normal emotions. However, when these emotions become severe enough that it interferes with a person's ability to function daily, and these feelings become persistent over time, then it can develop into a mental health problem. There are many different types of mental disorders. When left untreated, mental disorders can be chronic and long-lasting, and are associated with increased disability. They significantly have an impact on daily functioning and frequently interfere with family, social, and work responsibilities. Fortunately, there are effective treatments and evidence-based interventions available that aim to help individuals understand and cope with symptoms of mental illness. However, very few people with mental disorders access existing treatment services. This may be due to barriers such as the stigma attached to seeking help, the lack of understanding of mental health problems, uncertainty of how to get help, or the fear of disclosing mental health problems. Research shows that stigma remains one of the biggest factors preventing people from seeking help early for their mental health problems and getting the appropriate support they need. It is important to acknowledge that we all have mental health and have a personal responsibility to learn how we can improve and maintain our well-being in order to lead meaningful and satisfying lives. Want to learn how you can do this? Great news! Why not join one of our communities and keep exploring Maudsley Learning online?
Welcome to another episode of Health and Wellness. I'm your host, Roseann Green, and on this episode, we're going to speak about mental illness. And on the program with me is Alfonso Siverls, and he's a retired professor of psychology. Welcome to the program.
Thank
Alfonso.
you, Rose. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is such a significant topic because the statistics says that 1 in 5 adults experience a mental health condition every year. That's something very serious. That's something very serious. 1 in 5 adults. And this happens every year. So we want to talk about what exactly is mental illness.
Well, when you start talking about mental health, you got to realize that you're talking not only of, in other words, I'm in a state of good mental health means I does not only mean I don't have a mental illness or a mental problem like schizophrenia or bipolar or depression, but it also means that mentally I'm in a state of well-being.
Wow.
And what I mean by that, I'm in a state that I can handle the stresses in my life. So it's a pretty broad category when you talk about mental health. But the statistics that you said, 1 in 5, I'm not surprised.
Right.
I'm not surprised because when we look at mental health, the numbers are skyrocketing, especially in terms of the number of people who suffer from depression, and there's different types of depression
Right.
and different degrees and different anxiety disorders, you know, and it's directly related to conditions in society. You
Exactly.
increase the social problems, you increase the problems with people's mental health.
Exactly.
So for instance, the numbers of individuals in New York City in terms of homelessness has been increasing.
Exactly.
Now, if you, no matter how well mentally you had adjusted in the past, but if you're an individual who's been homeless and you're living on the street and you're in this sense of despair and a sense of hopelessness and don't see any way out, you have to be pretty strong to
Right.
be out there 4, 5 years, maybe some cases longer,
Wow.
and don't develop some difficulties with your mental health.
Exactly. And what another statistic that gets me a little bit sad about is that half of mental health conditions begin at age 14.
Yeah, yeah.
So early.
Signs are there. Not only is the signs are there, you know, we now know that conditions can run in families, it can run in groups.
Correct.
But it doesn't mean, say for instance in my family, there's a history of depression. You know, my aunts, my uncles, maybe my parents, maybe my brothers or sisters have it. That does not mean that I am going to develop depression because
Right.
it runs in my family. What it means that what runs in my family is a predisposition to depression.
Right.
So if I haven't developed the kinds of coping mechanisms to deal with stress,
Right.
and say you haven't developed the mechanisms to deal with stress very good either, and we are both confronted with the same stressful situation, I have this predisposition, so I am more likely to develop depression than you are.
Right. Wow.
And so that's how stuff is passed down from generation to generation to generation. Now, we've seen, and they call this genetic markers.
Right.
We've seen genetic markers passed down in just one generation. And this is fairly new. So, for instance, some recent research looked at children of parents who were in the Holocaust.
My God. Wow.
And they identified these genetic markers in which these people were had this predisposition to develop stress-related problems, or and then that can lead into mental illness because stress always produces anxiety.
Right.
Then they saw the same genetic markers in the children, and of course they had no experience of the Holocaust.
Right.
Now that's one generation. Now I say that because, you know, I'd like to think in terms of people of African descent. When we see these stress-related diseases like high blood pressure, diabetes, and other stress-related disease, of course their conditions is primed for stress,
Right.
full of stress. But can you imagine that for 250 plus years, our ancestors living in extreme trauma,
Exactly.
slavery, what that did to our genetic makeup,
Wow.
that made us more prone, more susceptible, generation after generation after generation,
Exactly.
to stresses, to our mental health.
Right. That is, you touch on something that is very important, and what I wanted to speak about is that you look in the minority community, as you said, African American and Black people, African, Caribbean, you find that the stressors, like the things that they go through, and they suffer from so many of these mental health issues because of, is it cultural or is it because they're
Predisposition.
yes, in a place.
It's both.
Yeah.
It's nature and environment. But here's the key. You take Caribbean Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latino, African Americans, we see high rates of stress-related disease like hypertension and diabetes. You take Africans or black people who ancestrally never experienced the Atlantic slave trade,
Right.
you don't see the same levels.
Exactly.
The difference is the slave experience, the enslaved experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's passed down
Right.
from generation
It
to
makes us
generation.
more susceptible. So you take groups of people then who have this genetic predisposition, then you put them in situations where there is discrimination,
Right.
where there is prejudice. You set up conditions where social mobility and decent living is much more difficult. You can expect to see issues with mental health.
Exactly. One of the things that I also want to speak about is that depression, because
Yeah.
earlier years before, there was a taboo. There was the question of, is depression really a mental illness? Or is it something that is just a condition based on a stressor that you're experiencing at the moment? Now they're diagnosing it and treating it. So
It's
talk
real.
to us about in terms of the era when it was tabooed or not classified as a mental illness.
In communities,
to now that it's
mental
changing.
illness is still, to some extent, in many communities, a taboo subject. You don't talk about it. If there's a person in the family is mental ill, you just don't bring that person up.
Exactly.
Mention that name.
Exactly.
That doesn't attend the family functions. I won't say nothing if you don't say nothing. And so that's the way it is. Even though we have to think of mental illness in terms of an illness. What does that mean? If I break my arm, you said, oh, poor me. You hurt your arm. But if I have a chemical imbalance in my brain and I'm hearing voices and I'm classified with a mental illness, oh no.
Right.
Oh no. And if you want to test that out, all you have to do is have two people go to any emergency room in the country. And one person runs up to the nurse and says, I'm having chest pains. They'll run and get the couch or whatever, wheelchair, and put you in and rush you to the doctor. And you have the second person go into the emergency room and run up to the nurse and say, I'm hearing voices. And see the reaction.
They look at you like, really?
Yeah.
Like, really? You're here for that kind of look? Like, really? Like, you need, or they'll tell you this is not the place for you.
Yeah.
Because they don't consider it as an emergency.
It is.
Kind of thing.
It's an emergency to the person. And the thing of it is that, in many cases, it's not because what the person did something wrong.
Exactly.
That causes something to go wrong. And we just have to change the way we treat it, the stigma associated with it. And hopefully that will change over time through more education.
Right. Another thing that I want to speak on is the flip side to that of going into the emergency room. Normally now I see that when you go to your primary care doctor, they give you a form that states, when is the last time you feel down?
Yeah,
when is the
depressed.
last time you feel sad? And if you dare to stick, recently I feel sad.
Yeah.
They're not like, okay, this one is crazy. And it's not so much of an outcry craziness, but it's so much of what was a stressor at that moment.
Sure.
So I think, how do you think that they put a broad umbrella on mental illness versus zoning in on the underlying cause of why you're feeling the way you feel?
Yeah, that's a good question. You have to look at both situations. You have to look at are there immediate kinds of stresses, and that's what we call acute stress.
Right.
And does the person has the coping skills to deal with those immediate kinds of things going wrong in my family, things are happening in my life, and can I cope with it? Now, are there long-term stresses or chronic stress? That's different. That's much more different. And stress and anxiety and depression, you have to take serious.
Right.
I don't care who you are, what your condition is in life, no matter what you have or don't have. If these disorders develop, then the problems can be extremely serious, especially depression. And we know this. You look at people who suffer from clinical depression, like a Robin Williams. Here's the funny man.
Surprising.
That
one was very surprising.
The comedian. The person who people loved all over the world. The person who people said had everything. Do you know the last week of his life, he locked himself in his room, closed the curtains, no light, did not come out of that room, and at the end, he hung himself in his closet with his belt.
Wow. But even the person...
And he was suffering from clinical depression most of his adult life.
Exactly. That's the thing. That's one of the things that I looked at. This wasn't something new.
No, it's never, no.
And I'm guessing if he had cancer, would the reaction from people be different? Or the urgency from people be different in terms of, let me get you help, let me get you the medical attention that you need in order to get better?
Well, the signs are serious because depression, if there's one true thing you want to know about depression, I'm talking about clinical depression. Major depression was that sense of hopelessness, was that loss of interest in anything in your life where you don't want to get out the bed. And it's prolonged. And in most cases, there's no immediate situation that triggers it. People who suffer from clinical depression, this sense of hopelessness, this lack of interest, if untreated, and eventually they are going to attempt suicide.
Exactly.
That is the only way out.
The percentage is alarming.
When I used to teach the students, I tried to explain depression to them, and I said, it's like being locked into a bubble, and you can't get out of that bubble. And in that bubble is filled with hopelessness, it's filled with depression, it's filled with loss of interest, problems concentrating, memory, problems with appetite, all this negativity occurring. And it's closing slowly in on you. And you only see one exit. And that's suicide.
Wow. And for mental illness, researchers, not just persons, researchers suggest or says that it's multiple linking causes that cause mental illness. It's not just genetics, but it's environment, it's stressor, as you said, stressors, but there are different things that contribute to
mental illness.
So it's not just being genetics, but it also, you can have it. And this is where I want you to talk to me on, there are a lot of persons where they say they're silent crazy, which is a wrong word to use. But people use it, and it's not empathetic when you say someone, you're crazy. You understand what I'm saying? When someone says, he's silent mad, you hear that term too, until something happened, like a traumatic experience or something extremely hard period in one's life triggers that thing. So talk to me a little bit.
Could be underlying thoughts. There could be urges in which you may not surface because you don't allow them to surface. You know, the thing about mental illness in some cases, for instance, when some individuals develop severe forms of mental illness, you don't think, I'll use your term, that you're crazy.
Exactly.
You don't think you have a problem. So that complicates things. Now, my behavior may show, that the opposite, but I don't see it as that. And when people disagree with it and don't see it the way I see it, then I believe that's their problem. So that's one of the things that prevent people from either seeking treatment or continuing treatment. So many individuals you would see like in the street and you wonder why. Well, why don't they do something? If a person says, no, I don't want to take that medication anymore, or no, I don't want to go into that institution. The way it's set up in this country, they have the right to do that. You can't be committed unless you consider that you're a threat to yourself or a threat to someone else. Now, I can hear these voices, and I can show this erratic behavior, but if I'm not a threat to another person or a threat to my own self, there's nothing anyone can do.
Exactly. Wow.
So, you know, that's more severe cases. Then you have cases in which people's personality don't show it.
Exactly.
But the tendencies may be there. You know, the tendencies, and unless I'm really looking at examining myself, or I have support in my life,
Exactly.
I will.
A big thing.
Yeah.
A big thing.
These tendencies can surface and erupt. You know, mental illness is a situation that's not just nature, genetic, and heredity. It's nature, genetic, heredity, and environment.
Exactly.
And once you say environment, that means everybody in your social circle can either contribute to you coping with it or contribute to the opposite effect.
Exactly, exactly. And another thing that I also looked at when I was just researching on this topic, I find that I'm greatly concerned, not just the findings, but after I see the findings, I was greatly concerned because a lot of persons who suffer from mental illness says that the medication caused them to be numb.
Yeah.
And it begs the question, is it that they're treating the underlying cause of the illness, or is it that they're giving them a fixer to so much of keeping them away from being
society, other
to
people.
society? So this medication is not really for the person experiencing mental illness.
You're
but
right.
it's so much
in a way,
securing the community.
Because you gotta understand something, and this is the most simplest thing in the world to understand. If you go to a doctor and says, I have a problem with my heart, he's going to check your heart.
Right.
You go to a doctor and say, I have a problem with my kidneys, he's going to check your kidney. We know everything in our mind is in our brain.
Exactly.
The treatment in mental illness, psychiatry, psychology is the only profession in the world that does not look at the organ that's involved.
Thank you.
All right?
Exactly.
But they don't look at the activity of the brain.
Exactly.
You know, they just take what you say to be, and then and now we know that something like simple as depression, and that's not simple, but it's much common.
Right, right.
It operates in the brain slightly different in each person. So medication that we apply that may be effective in one person and don't create side effects, their brain activity may be slightly different than the next person who has the same level of depression, but it's operating slightly different in the brain and slightly different impact.
Right.
The medication may cause other kinds of side effects with me.
Exactly.
So that brain is so complex that trying to get a one shoe fits all sizes.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work.
And this is a new science.
Right.
You got to understand, treating the brain is new, 50 years old. We're just learning about it. And so mental illness, in which is diseases in the brain, dysfunction in the brain, we have a long way to go.
Long way. And I do believe that as well, because as I was saying, a lot of times we take for granted in terms of, as you said, the complexity, the complications. Let me be safer with that word. The complications of the brain in terms of how to maneuver around the brain. You know what I mean? How to find out how to, because it is one of those organs that it marvels you when you try to understand how the brain works. It marvels you. So take the same way you do other research. Take that time to learn, because as you know, persons who suffer from mental illness, every case is
uniquely different. Yeah.
And it has to be treated as such.
Personalized medicine.
Exactly.
And this makes it more complicated, Rose, is that then we have people who may have similar symptoms, similar levels of a particular mental disorder, and one person can all of a sudden have a belief in something or a obsession in some activity, and that seems to help them and reduce their symptoms.
Wow.
With another person, it may not. So just the power of belief in the mind, we have no idea how this impacts. Why it's effective with one person,
Right.
my belief seems to work with my depression with someone else. It doesn't.
Right. And one of the correction I want to make on the show is that I understand that they give some persons who are suffering from mental illness or a depression or they suffer a trauma, a great trauma like losing a child.
Yeah.
I understand sometimes they give them that soother to calm them down
Sure.
so that they don't hurt themselves or
Exactly.
others. I understand that. But in the long term, it
Yeah.
can't be that you keep giving that person that numbness feeling of not feeling, because sometime or the other,
Yeah. Well,
they need to feel. They
well,
need to learn how to cope with that loss.
because psychotropic medication towards mental illness is not geared towards curing anybody.
Wow.
It's geared towards controlling symptoms. And the ideal case is that if I'm hearing voices and I'm acting kind of crazy and you can give me some substance, I don't hear the voice, I don't act so kind of wild, then we can sit and talk.
Wow.
And we can work through whatever issues I may have, or even if you can't help me work through my issue, you help me learn how to cope with them.
Right, right.
So that's the ideal case. So it's not just medication by itself, it's medication with counseling, therapy, support,
Right.
and all these other things.
Wow. And that's amazing. That's amazing. And as this episode come to a close, I want you to give our viewers some advice, especially for persons who they see signs of mental illness and they're not sure what to do with those signs. They're feeling a certain way. What would be your advice to them in terms of seeking help?
Take it serious. Take it very serious. If you are experiencing or you see someone experience, it's not a phase. And in many cases, if nothing is done, it will just grow bigger, stronger, a greater problem. So take it very serious. And don't be afraid. You need to bypass all these things that hold back people from seeking help. The important thing is to seek help. And it may not at first be some kind of professional. It may be a friend. It may be someone you're close to. But it's much better to talk about your problem than hold that problem in.
Exactly. And I want you to take that advice as we close. It's much better to talk about that problem than hold it. Don't hold it in. Don't hold it in, because it can do more hurt than good. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our viewers for joining us on another episode of Health and Wellness. And as I always say, stay well.